Adam Tooze. I'm at Columbia University when I'm not here, and it's my pleasure to be talking to you this afternoon, or perhaps if I put my teacher's hat on, I would be saying something like leading a discussion about the future of globalization and where globalization is headed. And it's always fascinating, fun, engaging to ask this question at WEF, Davos events, because probably there is nowhere else in the world, no other group of people to whom this matters more, this question. We are collectively what is known as the globalization elite, whether we like it or not. And this question haunts us all. I think it haunts us in a little bit the way, and looking around the room, I think this is a problem we probably all share, that mortality begins to haunt you in midlife. A lot of your life, you've gone through it imagining that it's inevitable and you will live forever. And I think many of us, and certainly Davos, staked quite a lot on the claim that globalization was that kind of phenomenon. Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of my country in the 2000s, had this amazing line where he said, you know, in India and China, they don't argue about globalization. Arguing about globalization is a little bit like arguing about whether the autumn follows the summer. And a little bit like people in middle age, when they discover their mortality, once you do, it's very difficult to think about anything else, at least for a couple of weeks after you've had that sudden shock. You just think you're going to die very soon, and you're constantly checking your body about which bit of it is going to fail first. And I kind of think that's the situation that we're in with globalization right now. Where does the essential sense of fragility come from? Well, I think the basic sense of fragility comes from the fact that deep down, even if we were committed to the idea it was a natural process like spring and summer, we actually knew it has a political framing. And we would, on a good day, point to key moments in global history and said, then wise men and women got together and organized the world. I heard it done yesterday. In 1945, pick your moment, in the early 90s, China's WTO accession, wise people agreed to do something. And of course, at that moment, you expose yourself to the risk that maybe we'll all change our minds, or some sort of craziness will take over. And if you look at the trajectory of trade treaties, we all know that the big global deals have gotten scarcer and scarcer and scarcer. And insofar as we're making any progress at all, it's at the regional level. WTO as a global organization failed already in 2008, not with Donald Trump. The Doha round was the last one that really collapsed. The good news, and this is the kind of realization that I want to bring us back to, is that for all of that, what we actually, as people engaged in the economy and business, know is that what has driven this trade process is perhaps political permission and political framing and legal codification, but above all, what has driven globalization has been the inherent vitality of the global economy, the discovery around the world of more and more places, more and more dots that are capable of trading with each other, the extraordinary development of the division of labor, the other side, which a conference like this tells so well when it mobilizes all of the extraordinary technologists and business people and entrepreneurs from both China and around the world to talk about new centers of growth. So we have this sort of duality, I think, in our minds, of on the one hand, the fragility, and on the other hand, this sense of robustness, and so much more that could happen, so much more that could happen. We freak ourselves out periodically with graphs like this. This is trade as a share of GDP. And you can see two things about it. It was increasing for many decades. These were the heyday of globalization, if you like. Then it has stabilized. And in the case of China, remarkably, for many people, it's actually regressed, right? So you get stories about China's deglobalization because trade as a share of Chinese GDP has reduced. But what to make of this? In this therapeutic session that we're going to be doing this afternoon, I think the crucial thing to focus on here is that this is the ratio between the movement of two very large aggregates. And neither of them actually is declining. It's just that in certain periods, one of those aggregates is growing more fast than the other. So what's happening in the Chinese case is that the big 2008 stimulus kicks in. China has its last great surge of infrastructure-driven, investment-driven growth between 2009 and 2015, and the rest of the world is growing much less rapidly because of the aftermath of 2008 and the Eurozone crisis. So Chinese exports are not rising as rapidly as they once was. And so you get this process which looks like deglobalization, but really is no such thing. And in a forum like this, when we're talking about the World Economic Forum, of course, what we try and do is open our minds to broader possibilities, the future of where globalization might come from. And you can look at a graph like this and see either dismal failure or vast opportunity. So this is the same sort of numbers, trade as a share of GDP for the world, and you see the plateauing here. This is what people call slowbalization or no globalization, right? The plateauing at the top, which is largely driven by the fact that some are still going up and China is going down really fast. But then there's this, and this is sub-Saharan Africa, which you can see is a huge, well, it's either a great failure of development since the 1970s, which is the story, if you like, of Afro-pessimism, or it is a giant gap waiting to be closed. It's a giant gap waiting to be closed by various types of bridging investment, by infrastructure investment. Certainly, in the face of this, it's an extraordinarily political act to declare globalization over before the most rapidly growing population on Earth has even joined to a considerable extent, right? Because this is the center of demographic growth. A huge percentage of the young labor force of the world will be in Africa by 2050. And if we are already saying that the phase of globalization is over, we should be at the very least realizing the implication of what we are signing up for. The very least, and the likely fallout from it. I say that with a European accent with particular feeling, because nowhere will that matter more than in Europe, which for a long time has seemed like a backwater of globalization. But in this next phase, where Africa's demographic growth is going to be the decisive driver, is the critical, you could say, front line between the rich and the poor world, to put it in rather unfortunate military terms. What we know about this globalization process is not just that it's unsteady, but that it's unplanned, it's haphazard. And so one of its persistent features, which is another source of sort of anxiety, my aim here really today is to tick along the list of anxieties and address each one and see whether we can find a different way of relating to it so that we can carry on, right? Rather than continuously obsessing about the imminent mortality of globalization, are its imbalances. The blue dots are surpluses, the red dots are deficits. You see the great imbalance in the world between the manufacturing hubs of East Asia, notably China, the giant blue dot, and the great deficit gaping on the other side. Now, you can think of that as natural complementarity. You can think of that as the division of labor in action. You can think of that as a highly efficient manufacturing center complementing the vast excess demand of an extremely rich and affluent society on the other side of the world. But as we all know, this is also the source of repeated predictions of disaster, of crisis, of deficits that must unwind, of double deficits in the American case, trade deficit and government deficit, a sort of an imbalance that has to resolve itself. Another kind of cliche, I think, which living in the modern world is hard to sustain, and yet we can't really rid ourselves of it, which is that tensions in the end have to resolve themselves. We're always waiting for narratives to somehow resolve the tension in the phrase that I'm just going to carry on maintaining until my breath runs out, right? But we want that sentence to end in a calm place. And there is a narrative about the global economy that wants this deficit to go away, because how could it possibly be the case that we could sustain this kind of gap? The huge deficits of the Anglosphere down here and the piled up surpluses on this side. And prophecy after prophecy after prophecy, if you remember back to before 2008, there was this big story of the dollar unwinding, has hinged on this. But the astonishing thing about this system over the last, in fact, really for most of modern economic history, is it's very difficult to think of a single advanced economy crisis that was actually driven by trade imbalances. It's really quite difficult to think of one that was, its primary logic was trade imbalances. Trade suffers shocks, as you can see here in the early 1990s, or you can see here in the unwinding of deficits down here. You can see major shifts at various places over the course. Here we have the unwinding of deficits in around 2008. But it isn't so much trade imbalance that drives crisis, so much as crisis that drives trade imbalance. So the 2008 crisis was classically an instance of massive bank failure that disrupted global trade, and 2020 was an instance of a natural catastrophe that disrupted trade. Trade, in fact, itself proved remarkably resilient. But one of the things that these imbalances do is to repeatedly produce, charge up tension. Trade produces winners and losers, and that's one of the things I think that makes it, for the winners, of course, incredibly compelling, but those on the losing side continuously a cause to question it. And we have two graphs which summarize in really dramatic form the way that logic has played out. And for many of us, this really summarizes the experience of globalization in recent years, in recent decades. It's a tricky graph and it changes over time. The one that you may be more familiar with is the red graph. And what this shows you is all 8 billion people in the world distributed over their income level. And then what you've got along the left-hand side there is the pace at which their income has grown over this period. So what the red line is showing you is that up to about the 70th percentile of the global income distribution, the period from the 1990s through 2008 was great. But if you were in this percentile, so the top 20% of the global income distribution, which is working class and lower middle class people in the advanced economies, in other words, the United States and Europe, your growth rate in income collapsed in this period. So if you take the world's population, not country by country, put all 8 billion of us in a pot, what this graph is telling you is that the bottom surged. This is the China convergence story. And the top, that's us in this room, did fantastically well. And that there is the employees of the vast majority of big corporations in the advanced economic world, right? And their economic experience in this period between the 1990s and 2008 was absolutely miserable. Both in absolute and in relative terms, their incomes are not going up and they're being caught by other people in the world. What we've seen since then is some readjustment in that story. But if you want to understand, I think, the roots of populist politics in the advanced economic world, which are going to play out, for instance, in the French elections at the weekend, this is where to look. Because if you want to know who votes for the far right in France, it's unemployed and working class people, who are the people who've been caught in this squeeze here. And if you look cross-nationally, you can see why globalization has become polarized in the way it has. This is a staggeringly star graph, which I came upon while I was researching this slide deck for you. But it shows, relative to the baseline of 1990, the percentage gained of GDP attributable by a reasonably credible model to different countries. And you can see the spectacular winners all down this end, right? The East Europeans, China, South Korea down this end, and all the way down here, the United States. If you want to ask why right now there isn't a single live political party in the United States that stands for free trade and globalization, this graph gives you some idea of why that might be the case. There just wasn't very much in it for the vast majority of Americans. Again, for folks like us in the room, it's easy to think of exceptions. It's pretty hard to imagine how any of America's biggest corporations could have produced the outsized returns they have without their global engagement. But that pertains to a very small part of the American income distribution. For the vast majority of Americans, globalization has not been a winning story. So if we want to know why this feels fragile, it's not just, as it were, the exhaustion of a natural paradigm of globalization, but hidden within that deeply political questions about who wins and who loses. Who wins domestically within countries, and which countries win globally as opposed to others. And we all know the explosive tensions that this has unleashed in the global economy in the current moment. So far, and now we come back to reality, and we're doing our pat down, we're discovering we're all still here, like, I'm not actually dead yet. You're not dead yet unless you're a European bank. If you're a European bank and you suffered the impact of 2008, you might very well actually be dead, or at least your business model is totally different now from what it was in 2008. The idea of the globalized European bank as the platform for a rivalry with the big Wall Street banks, for instance, is a victim of 08-09, and it really barely comes back. Apologies to anyone in the room who represents any one of those banks. But viewed at the global level, the single biggest process of deglobalization that we've seen is the retreat of European banking across the North Atlantic divide. And it was a deliberate push by both corporate management to escape entanglements that almost killed them, and by American regulators to take bad actors out of the American financial system whose risks they weren't able to manage but ended up on the hook for in 08-09. Deutsche Bank, Barclays were all called out by the American regulators, and their American operations were dramatically shrunk deliberately. This is the first really dramatic deglobalization that's actually happened. The question going forward is whether it can happen anywhere else. And I think the story here at this moment is really tense. So now we're in the phase of this coming to terms with ourselves, in which we've discovered A, our mortality, and B, the fact that we're still alive. And the next question is, okay, what do I do next to keep it that way for as long as possible? And what we're seeing right now is an extraordinarily tense standoff between the rhetoric of politics, which says we need to do decoupling and de-risking, and we need to rethink and quite fundamentally change the way in which the world economy operates right now, and this graph here. Because what this graph here shows you is that China's manufacturing growth, export growth, is just growing relentlessly, year after year after year. In fact, from a Western point of view, the staggering quality of this is look how late it starts getting big. In other words, the realization that we're coming to is that China's move, as they call it here, up the value chain into high-quality productive forces is just beginning. We haven't actually seen it yet. What we saw so far was a relative subordinate incorporation of China into value chains dominated by the West. What we're on the cusp of seeing is China inverting that. And that's the drama of the next stage, or from the point of view of Western politics, the nightmare. And that is, as it were, the situation that we're on the edge of. Now, my basic view of this, a little bit like our discovery of mortality, is that you could just shrug and say, you know what, I'm just going to forget about it. I don't really need to sign up to the gym membership or could give up smoking or any other of my dangerous lifestyles. I'm just going to go back to, not caring. And I think there's a possibility in Western politics that just simply, at some level, abandons the decoupling narrative, abandons the de-risking. We all know where this is going. As long as the American bilateral deficit with China shrinks, this can divert for any number of other countries. It'll still end up as American imports, but it won't have a China label on it, and we can all move on. And this, I think, is a thoroughly reasonable and quite realistic outcome of this current moment of panic. But there is another version. There is another version in which Western governments actually get real about this challenge and double down. And that really, I think, is the substance of the current moment, is we're at a moment where we could simply say we tried decoupling and de-risking, at least for a couple of years, and really, in the end, we couldn't break the attachment to Chinese manufactured goods. They're too cheap and they're too good. And the Chinese are changing the envelope. So you know what? We're going to find ways, and democratic politics offers many ways of doing this, of just burying this story. Or we could double down. And I think that's the issue that we really have to worry about. And there are certain areas, I think, where we can't escape the doubling down. Because the doubling down is driven by geopolitical logics that Graham Allison understands better than anyone else in the world. The geopolitical logic that says America must preserve primacy in key areas of technology, and it will define how small that yard is and how high the walls are. And it is said that it is going to dominate or is going to substantially shift within the envelope of its alliances with South Korea and Japan, the balance of, and Taiwan, the balance of microchip production. It's incredibly expensive to do because, as we all know in this room, microchip production is hugely cyclical and hugely capital intensive. And so you're pitting a democratic budget against one of the toughest industries to actually do industrial policy in, and God help you. But they will keep trying. I think it's a reasonable wager to say that they will keep trying. There are other productive systems in which we, for instance, could imagine regionalization, which will be a soft way of dealing with this. You could, for instance, the automotive supply chain has always been fundamentally regional, right? It's always been a North American bloc, a largely European bloc, a largely East Asian bloc. One could imagine a segmentation of the electric vehicle space that was essentially along those lines. And one could imagine compromises. And I don't think we should discount what the Europeans are saying, what Habeck was saying on his visit to China this week, which is there is a grand bargain available for China in this space on EVs with the Europeans. Because the Europeans are actually kind of serious about the energy transition, and they need 10 million vehicles by 2030, and there's no way on earth they're going to be able to make them at affordable prices themselves, and China can. And so there is a bargain to be had there if it's played right. But I think the broader issue of whether we go to an even larger struggle at this point really is down to politics. And there's no way of getting around this. This is not something that's a comfortable topic for a forum like Davos, but fundamentally it comes down in many ways to the outcome of the American election on the 5th of November. And right now, if you just take the simple polling, it's 49 to 49. If you do complex modeling in the swing states, the Economist model, for instance, gives Trump a 2 to 1 kind of no. It's a 2/3 out of, so it's a, it's a 2-to-1 advantage over Biden in terms of the probability of victory. And the consequence of that, which is not a natural process, but the complex, arbitrary, contingent operation of democratic politics, which for a group of folks like ourselves in a forum like this, and the location we're in, is really about as alien as you could really get to. It's really a dramatic gap. The speech that we heard from Premier Lee the other day, you just can't imagine a Western politician giving. It was the speech of a highly competent industrial policy CEO, spelling out, actually wanting to demonstrate to us that he fully understood his brief, fully understood it, and has a historical theory explaining why China needs to do what it does. Imagine any Western politician attempting to do that. I mean, Robert Habeck, maybe of the Greens, could do it, but I wouldn't really. Macron, a very good day, if he let his speechwriters go, but that isn't the way they roll, right? So as Graham said as an Igwell the other day, if I may cite, we're in silly season. We literally have to admit from the Western point of view that we are in silly season insofar as the major axis of globalization is concerned. And I'll leave you with that. And then we have 10 minutes for questions. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions? I believe I'm managing myself up here, which is a weird position to be in, but help. Yes, please. Thank you.
Just following up on your last point, by the way, I'm a part of Global Shapers. Following up on your mentioning of the Premier Lee's speech, what kind of real policies you think from his speech will be materializing? Like maybe he talked about, the aging society, right?
Yes.
Will there be some a real policy maybe in the side regarding that space?
Well, I'm not going to be presumptuous enough to read the implications of a speech like that by a senior Chinese politician in a forum like this for actual Chinese politics. But I think what was really interesting about that, and maybe that's an interesting way to expand the rather tightly focused remarks I've made, is that insofar as we are moving towards a real reckoning with an aging society, I think it is a potential avenue to escape some of the hard zero-sum industrial policy clashing logic that this picture of the future of the world economy would suggest. Because aging societies, insofar as they are centered on care economies, are not going to be purely service sector, because caring for elderly people involves quite a lot of really high-tech machinery. That's where all of the really big bucks are spent in the medical industrial complex, is on keeping relatively affluent people alive for those last couple of years, right? When it really gets serious. You can spend 17% of GDP doing that, as the Americans do, right? It's a huge business, but it's at the point of delivery not directly competitive, at least not on a large scale. And I actually think for a more realistic view of the future of the economy for high-income countries, it's actually imperative, I was saying this last night at the discussion we had about the American economy, that we back away from this at some level anachronistic, old-fashioned view that the future of the vast majority of working people in our countries belongs in a factory, which produces goods which are shipped to somewhere else in competition with goods produced in factories in China. It's ridiculous. It doesn't. 13 million Americans work in manufacturing out of a workforce of 170 million people. It's just slightly less than 10%. If you look at the value added in a affordable piece of consumer goods delivered to an American consumer by a big box store like Walmart, 80% plus of the value added is on the American side, in the logistics, in the retail. A very small fraction of it is actually in the factory production on the Chinese side. It's really a mistake to understand the future of our economies in terms of growth in a head-to-head using chip factories as the model. Chip factories may or may not be important for geopolitical reasons, may or may not. I think it's an open question. But what they certainly don't do is address the broad socioeconomic structure of any country, because they employ far too few people, and they even less address the sort of malaise, the sense of crisis that affects the United States today, which has much more to do with ill health, the lack of basic social services. And so you stacking them all together and saying we're going to fix the problems of American society by means of relocating chip factories in Ohio is a disaster from the point of view of global economics and American politics, because it can't deliver. That is, as it were, the third element of possible futures cynicism, escalation, and an incoherence which in the end bites you back. You overpromise, you can't deliver, you can't actually change the world with these kind of policies, and that kills you in the end. Question at the back.
Thank you for a very engaging presentation, Adam. You mentioned China is at a cusp of going full-blown in terms of, upscaling their manufacturing capabilities. So what chance the rest of the world has, given what we've already seen China do what they've done in the last 20 years?
Depends which bit of the rest of the world you're talking about. So Bangladesh, for instance, is slotted in very neatly underneath the Chinese value chain as the Chinese value stack has moved up, right? And Bangladesh has become a key player in the global textiles and garment sector, in part through collaboration with Chinese firms which were previously in that space. It's not a road to global dominance or industrial parity, but it's a road to broadly based development in Bangladesh, which saw an incredible overtaking of India in GDP per capita terms. Really a remarkable story. But I think it has to be a niche strategy like that. And it also depends what sectors you're in and what the overall volume of demand is and how far tradable goods are really the answer and how far China will locate. I'm a liberal enough to believe that there's a limit to what China will be able to do and there will be niches. But yes, you're absolutely right. China's historic growth from the 90s onwards, there will never be another development path like it because there's never been one like it in history. And the idea that we will be able to repeat that anywhere else, India, for instance, I think has zero chance of being able to follow up that same path. It's also a very unusual, heavy industrial, very industrial-centered strategy that isn't necessarily suitable for very many countries. So I think that would be the way I would think about it is niches, complementarity, and a realism that says that wasting money on strategies that can't really deliver is very bad politics and very bad economics at the same time. The question from the lady at the front here.
So what next for us in Europe and US? What we are seeing so far is that basically we are copying a little bit of the politics and the industrial policies of China. Is this the way forward?
I mean, on the American side, I guess I've said that I really think a lot depends on the outcome of this election. Not in the basic orientation of American policy towards China. We've seen huge consistency between the Trump and the Biden administration. But in the possible escalation towards, one has to describe it, I think, as it's a politics of trade that's driven by symbolism, by a rather mercantilist understanding of economics. Robert Lighthizer was mentioned last time in the panel yesterday. It's a very odd crew of people who are taking charge of American policy. I mean, some of them are in jail right now. Other than, I'm not talking about Trump, right? And they're not very long jail sentences, unfortunately. So they're going to come out of jail by the time they come into office, and they won't be in a good mood. On the European side, I really think the question is is the resource mobilization question. It's always the European question, right? There is huge potential. I think there's really credible commitment to the energy transition. Europe has everything it would need, basically structures to be a sovereign issuer of essentially a sovereign reserve currency, which would give it huge fiscal freedom like the Americans enjoy. And there are a series of very complex nested political obstacles which prevent that from happening. Locally, individual countries may be able to break out. An emergency might trigger it. We'll see what happens after the French election and where the ECB lines up. It's an extraordinarily open field, I think. Can we take one more question? Yes, the woman at the back in black.
Thank you so much for the enlightening speech. Really enjoyed a lot. I'm Elise. I'm in the new energy sector and I'm based in Beijing. Currently, I think the new energy players in China, neither you do solar panels, the batteries, the EVs, are suffering a lot from the barriers that already exist or to be placed in the future. My question is, I understand the policymakers, they have their standpoint of view to make the manufacturing industry strong again in the local. But for the people, the companies that's actually going to pay for it for real dollars, will they actually pay for the stuff that's like twice expensive while using the technology that's 5 years behind China?
We were speaking about this yesterday as well with regard to America. There's this weird schizophrenia in which the working class American is all of a sudden very present in American politics. Everyone has a guilty conscience because of that elephant curve, the way in which they did very badly. But they're evoked in this fantastic form, which is an auto worker. Hey, the vast majority of working class people, I have to break it to Joe Biden, don't work in factories and do things with metal, right? They're largely women, they're largely diverse people of color, and they work in the service sector, and their basic problem is the cost of living. And so if you're actually interested in the standard of living of the American working class, starting by building a factory with protectionism around it is a very bad way to go, because what they really need is affordable, cheap mobility. And right now, it's Korean and Japanese firms which allow them to buy those cars, and if you close the market, your question bites. If I may, since I'm on this grandstand, I'm actually more concerned strategically about the Chinese government's relationship to the green energy sector in the next coming years, because your sector is a world transforming sector. You're the first country to achieve something like escape velocity in the green energy transition. And that causes all sorts of dislocations as you do that. As you increase the share of intermittent power in a stressed grid, it's hard to handle. And we've seen in Europe, as the share went up, and you're still way below the levels in California and Europe, how the conservative backlash kicked in the 2010s and slowed down the green energy transition. And if you look at National Energy Agency planning for China for the coming year, it's way more pessimistic than what you've actually already achieved in the last 2 years. It's a third the level, right? The long-term plan is 100 gigawatts a year if you listen to the head of the National Energy Agency. And why this is critical is that next year China has to commit to its Paris commitment, which maps the trajectory over the next 10 years. And you have two options. One is to go for a kind of conservative stability, which may look appealing in the short run, but come 2035, if you want to hit the net zero by 2060 target, you're crash landing. Or you double down on the incredible dynamism of the sector in the last, and it's really recent, right? It's the last 3 or 4 years that it's totally exploded. You double down on that, you take the risk of double downing on it, and you increase the momentum rather than slowing it down. And I'm haunted by the story in Germany, which you will, coming from the Chinese solar sector, know, because Germany was driving global solar through 2010, 2011, and then it throttles it and kills it dead, which was the beginning of the Chinese domestic program. And we cannot afford China to do a Germany. You know, if we're at all serious about the global energy transition, your sector is the thing that will save the world. You are the most dramatic mover of the energy equation we've ever seen. And so it's like I think everyone should just be pushing on and just communicating the scale of the drama of this choice. And the European and the American markets are a pain. I totally understand. As an export-orientated business, this hurts. But it's the domestic market, as far as the climate crisis is concerned, that's most pivotal. And one can only hope that Beijing has the courage and the historical vision to recognize what's actually happened in this country in the last 3 to 4 years, which has taken everyone in their world by such surprise, because we were all busy with COVID and Trump and God knows what, and we didn't understand that the energy revolution that we'd all been asking for was actually arriving here. And one hopes that that message is also really clear at the extraordinarily competent and clearly very technocratically minded leadership level in China. So thank you for what you do.